Welcome to the Screen the Screener College Basketball Podcast with your hosts, Mike Randle and Gus Kearns.
Welcome back to the Screen the Screener College Basketball Podcast, where we continue previewing each and every one of the 357 Division I basketball teams. I'm your host, Mike Randle. Follow me on Twitter at RandleRant, and today we go up to Rhode Island to preview the Providence Friars with Mike Hopkins. Mike is the one-stop shop for everything Providence. You can follow him on Twitter at PCBB1917, and he joins us for a few minutes here to preview the Friars coming into this season. Big East Conference, of course, looking to make a name, to continue moving forward, and to build on that success that they've had in the past. Mike, thank you so much for joining us. How you doing?
Good. Thanks for having me. Definitely looking to build on their success and maybe get out of this little funk they've been in the last few years.
Yeah, Coach Cooley now has been with the program. I believe this is his 11th year that he's been with Providence, of course. And Providence has gotten to a point where they're a team that you come in, you know it's going to be a difficult game. It's going to be a battle. But talk about last year, how they went into it and how things were dealing with COVID and everything. They got off to a pretty fast start. They were 5-2 right off the bat, had a nice road win at Seton Hall, then sort of went up and down through the year, ended up with a home win over Villanova on Saturday, March 6th, and then the struggling loss there to DePaul in the Big East Conference Tournament. But talk about how they dealt with last year, expectations, and if COVID affected them in any way throughout the season.
Yeah, they were one of the teams that was impacted by COVID in the sense that they did not do any summer. They were pretty much late August to campus. So I know that was not too different from a lot of other schools, but some of their compatriots in the Big East did have at least partial summer. So they really were behind the eight ball a little bit in that regard. Sort of integrating some new faces. They had a couple transfers in, guys that actually were not really thought of to maybe play, but ended up playing because of the COVID rule of allowing the transfers who maybe were going to sit. But really the key thing that sort of derailed the season, the easiest thing to look for is the fact that their point guard, Jared Bynum, who had sat out the previous year under the old transfer rules from St. Joe's after a good freshman year, went down January 2nd against Creighton. So that really hurt them, although he wasn't playing great. So it's kind of hard to blame the whole thing on him. But the reality is then it forced David Duke, now with the Brooklyn Nets, to sort of step into the role that they were trying to get him off the ball. He had to come back on the ball a little more. And it really just was never what they wanted. And the other, I think, COVID impact really with this team with some new faces not having the summer and then probably a little bit of a modified schedule for practice in the fall. They never really had this defensive identity that you normally see from an Ed Cooley team. I mean, they were pretty it's often, and this is a frustration that I know fans have had, is it takes a while for Cooley's teams to figure it out. But they're usually pretty good on defense most of the time, so they can kind of get by until they get the offensive end figured out to the extent that they ever do. But, I mean, just as an example, you see the defense, Cooley's best defensive teams are the ones that have had the most success, barring the 1 year that they won the Big East tournament with Bryce Cotton, and that was because of Bryce Cotton, because they had a top 30 offense. But that's not the norm for Ed Cooley. So the defensive struggles were a big thing, and the fact that they didn't have a true point guard. I mean, just going back and looking at some of the stats for the three previous years before this little run of missing the NCAA tournament, they had 18th, 4th, 5th, 1st, 20th in the nation in assist rate, one of their players. They haven't had anything close to that the last 3 years. So, I mean, you're talking about guys like Kyron Cartwright, who's one of the better point guards that they've had at Providence, and then Chris Dunn, obviously, with the NBA now, and a little bit of Bryce Cotton. So it's been a little bit of a challenge figuring out the point guard, and I think that's going to be the biggest key looking forward. But it was just an up-and-down year all around, and they just never really got their feet under them. And, you know, COVID can be blamed a little bit, but everybody was, at the end of the day, when the ball rolled out for the first game, it was the same for everybody. So I don't know how much you can really put stock in the late start. It definitely impacted them. But, you know, 2-3 game losing streaks in the Big East really just sunk the season. And there's probably a bunch of reasons, but I think point guard play being a huge one.
Yeah, the Bynum injury and him being in and out of the lineup was a real challenge. Just to look at the last couple of years, they have ranked number one within the Big East in adjusted defensive efficiency per Ken Palm. And this past year, they were fourth. They were solid against three-pointers, only allowed 28.7%, which I think is critical now, Mike, in the way college basketball is. But that certainly was an issue. And losing your point guard, regardless of whether he's a big-time scorer or not, really has a trickle-down effect. They are bringing back a good amount of players, however. You mentioned David Duke. They lost him, had a spectacular career. Jimmy Nichols, Greg Gant. But you do have some major players returning. A good core here for Coach Cooley, headlined, of course, by A.J. Reeves and Nate Watson.
Yeah, and I think actually one of their newcomers might be the key to the season, which is kind of crazy to say. Al Durham, who is a transfer out of Indiana. It seems like he's probably going to be competing with Bynum, and it's still early. They just started practice last week, but I would not be surprised if you see Durham having the ball a lot more than maybe was expected of him at Indiana, because I know that's what he wants to do. He said that pretty clearly when he committed to Providence, that he was going there because they told him he could have the ball more in his hands. Mm-hmm. And then that's probably a little bit of an indictment of Bynum, the fact that they have a fourth-year junior point guard on their roster, bringing in somebody like Durham, but Durham has already become a leader in the locker room, which is kind of amazing in and of itself. He's only been there a few months now. But yeah, I think, and the other guy that sort of entered the mix when Bynum went down, and probably to his benefit in the long run, is Allen Breed, who's a sophomore this year. And but he's a little bit more of a playmaking scoring guard, but he's the kind of guy that Ed Cooley likes to coach. He can take a yelling, which is something Ed Cooley likes to do with his point guards. And keep moving. So, yeah, I think the thing that's going to be interesting to see is how much the offense actually runs through Nate Watson, and how much of the offense that Nate Watson gets is offense that he creates himself. He's never been a particularly good rebounder on either side of the ball, but I do think they will probably go to him in the post more than many teams would do, just because he is that good of a scorer in the block. The question, I think, will be for him, because he'll get numbers, because teams won't be able to guard him. A lot of teams just can't match up with him physically. So he'll be able to score, but the question is, can he actually do it in a way that, another big weakness he's had is passing out of the post. If he's gotten better at that, I think that would be huge. They also have a guy, Noah Horkler, who transferred from North Florida and is coming back for his extra COVID year. He came on real strong at the end of last year, playing like the 4-5. So they have a lot of different options, and really, you mentioned it. I mean, AJ Reeves, this is his year. He's the senior. He came in with Duke. The two of them were sort of the prize recruits for the next generation of Cooley teams, and he had a really good start to his freshman year. He had an ankle injury and midway through this freshman year, and he kind of hasn't been the same. He has been very up and down. So to the extent that they can get a little bit more out of him, I think that would be obviously a key, because his shooting can open up the whole thing for them.
You have Justin Minaya coming in from South Carolina. We got to watch him a lot. I think he's a glue guy. He's a guy that can do a little bit of everything. And I think having people in roles is critical for Coach Cooley. I mean, obviously the defense will be there, and the offense needs to get more efficient. I think Minaya can serve as a really solid sixth man for you coming off the bench from South Carolina.
Yeah, and the reports out of practice early on and the preseason are that his body is in great shape. He's coming back from some injuries, so I think he's pretty hungry. And he's the kind of guy, a versatile sort of guy that can play like 2 through 4, and he's a good rebounder. And that's the kind of guy Cooley really likes. He's had guys like that before with an Alpha Diallo, somebody who can do a little bit of everything. Maybe not the ball handler at Diallo, but I think he's the kind of guy that maybe doesn't start. Maybe he is the sixth man, like you said, but he's one of the 5 at the end of a lot of games because of his defense and rebounding and toughness. So I think you'll probably see that, especially early in the year, when I think Cooley's going to really rely on his older players, even though he's new to the program. He's been around. He's played a ton of college basketball. So yeah, I think Minaya is going to be a big factor for them too.
And one of the things with such a core coming back, Mike, is an advantage for the Friars is that many schools have an influx of 1 million transfers, 5-6 transfers that maybe comprise at least 60% of their starting lineup. I would think that having a solid core returning would be very beneficial, particularly in the non-conference schedule. Talk about the non-conference. Last year, they got 6 games in: Providence, Fairfield, Indiana, Davidson, Alabama, Fairleigh Dickinson, TCU. That's a rough run. Of course, in the Big East, it's going to be very difficult with all those games, and you're going to get plenty of points and competition from those games. But talk about the non-conference and what they have coming in, because I do think a good start for Providence is critical this year.
Yeah, agreed. And that's sort of been a bit of a bugaboo for them, is slow starts. But yeah, I mean, relatively easy opening with Fairfield and Sacred Heart, although you never know, I guess. But those should be 2 easy wins. And then they're back in the Gavitt games this year against Wisconsin. Wisconsin was having some issues in their program, and that maybe isn't as strong of a game as it looks, but it's still a road game against a Big Ten opponent. So that'll be a good test, 3rd game of the year. And they get really another good opportunity down in Newark at the Prudential Center for the Legends Classic. Northwestern, I think, another program in the Big Ten that's a little bit in flux. They had some success, and then it's sort of fallen off a little bit for Chris Collins. But if they can win that game and get a Virginia in the next game versus Georgia, Georgia would be okay too. It's still a Power 5 type program on a neutral. But if you can beat Northwestern and then get a chance at UVA, that would be probably the best case scenario in terms of how the schedule plays out. Win or lose that game, it's still probably beneficial on a neutral to have that experience and something on the resume. And then really, Texas Tech is, I think, one that a lot of the fans are pretty excited about being at the Dunkin' Donuts Center, part of the Big East Big 12 battle. Tough being on a Wednesday night at 8:30, but it is what it is for TV, I suppose. But Texas Tech has a ton of talent, and I think they'll probably be an NCAA tournament team. And then the game that didn't happen last year, that's sort of the big deal in the state of Rhode Island, is the game against the University of Rhode Island, which I think smartly Providence opted not to play last year. They play every other year between the Dunkin' Donuts Center and the Ryan Center. So why would Providence give up their year to play at the Dunk? So I think that was probably smart. I know there was a lot of consternation about that locally, but that'll be a fun one. And then really the only other game probably that could be a challenge is Vermont. Vermont is just always good, but Providence has usually handled them pretty well. But yeah, I think overall, this is a pretty typical schedule for Ed Cooley. Brian Blaney is the assistant on his staff that handles largely most of the scheduling. This is pretty standard. Some Northeast and local games against the St. Peter's and UNH's and Sacred Heart, Fairfield type programs, and then you sprinkle in like a Vermont who's probably going to win their league. You always have the game against URI, barring last year. And then, the Big 12 game has sort of been a new wrinkle. They got Texas last year. So that's, I think, a good add to the schedule. And the fact that they now have UConn in the Big East with 20 league games means that they're basically playing one less non-conference game. So their non-conference slate ends a little earlier maybe than usual on December 11th when they break for their final exams before the league season kicks off against UConn. But I think overall it should be a good test, and there are enough games in there early on that you kind of, I think there'll be a pretty good feel for this team and what kind of success they can have once the league schedule gets going.
Mike, we can't thank you enough for a few minutes. Last question, then we'll get you out of here. The one we ask everyone: what are the expectations for Providence? Coach Cooley is a solid coach. This team has talent. They have a lot of players returning. When you have a situation like Watson and Reeves and Horsler, Bynum being back, and a couple good transfers, Al Durham, Minaya, this is a team that a lot of people nationally are identifying as a sleeper. What would make for a satisfying season, do you think, for most Providence fans as we head into 2021, 2022?
Well, I think the baseline is getting back to the NCAA tournament, and it can be really hard for Providence fans to, especially depending on how old they are, to really put in perspective the job that Ed Cooley has done in the 10 years that he's been there already. The fact that they went to 5 straight NCAA tournaments, which had never happened before, really has raised the level of expectation to the point where everyone is disappointed. And I think the pre-COVID COVID season, the one that ended with COVID, was the year that they were the hottest team in America. And I think that was the year everyone felt like they were maybe going to make the run, that the next step that has been missing for Ed Cooley, where you got to get to a Sweet 16 or better. So I think that's always the expectation. But I think having said all that, in general terms, I think for this particular team, I think everyone would be happy to cut the streak short, get back to the NCAA tournament. The Big East is so, I think, open this year. I don't know that Villanova is going to be as dominant as they've always been. They'll still be really good. But they've had some. There's some more question marks maybe than they usually have heading into a season. So I think that the league is pretty open. So I think you'll see in a lot of the preseason polls, Providence picked anywhere from like 3 to 7 or 8. But I think they probably end up in the top half. Somewhere in like the 3rd to 5th range is probably what I think is reasonable. And I think they will get back to the NCAA tournament. But I think that's the expectation. The expectation now, which is really when you think about the job he took over from Keno Davis 10 years ago, 11 years ago, is kind of a crazy world to live in. But that's the new reality of Providence, and that's because of how successful they've been under Ed Cooley. So it's the other side of the coin on winning is the expectations. But yeah, I think probably like a 3, 4, 5 finish in the league, somewhere in the ballpark of 20 to 22 wins in the overall regular season, and maybe somewhere in the 7 to 11 range in the NCAA tournament. That's sort of been their bread and butter. So I think that's probably what the expectations are and what they should be. And I think they probably will get to the NCAA tournament, but you just never know. Matchups are so important there if anything is going to happen, if you're going to actually win a game or two. So it's kind of hard to say a week into practice, but I think that the group and the culture in the program is strong enough that they can probably get back.
And we've seen what happens Providence with a solid defensive team, athletes, veteran presence, and a leader like Coach Cooley. They can make a run. We saw it back in 2014 when they won the Big East Conference tournament there, got on a streak and got into the tournament. It looks like they are headed for another strong end to the season with hopefully an NCAA tournament bid as well coming around the corner. Folks, Mike Hopkins, everything on Providence. He gave it to you here. Follow him on Twitter at PCBB1917. Mike, thank you for a few minutes. We love to catch up during the season, and hopefully the Friars here can get on a run and really make some magic come February and March here in the college basketball landscape.
Thanks, Mike. I appreciate it.
Cozy in the candlelight.